this month, we are really excited to have Dr. Christopher Weatherly. He is joining us from from the University of Georgia School of Social Work, where he is an assistant professor. We have a topic this month that we're excited about. So you may know that May is Mental Health Awareness Month. So he is going to be talking about mental health within the One Health framework. So Dr. Weatherly, his research areas of interest include strengthening rural mental health systems and unpacking the intersections of climate change, environmental degradation, species loss, and mental well-being. So with that, Dr. Weatherly, I'm going to turn it over to you to get started.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone, and hi, Mom. I see my mom is here, which is nice. I hope everyone's doing well today. I will share my screen and go to full screen. Um, and I always feel I have to narrate things as I do them online, or else I lose myself. Hi, everyone. So thank you so much for coming to my talk today on sort of looking at identifying, strengthening, and expanding the mental health component within the One Health framework. I just want to first thank the University of Tennessee's One Health Initiative, and particularly Alyssa, for inviting me here. It's truly an honor, and I hope that this talk is helpful for you all. So speaking of my talk, here's just a general outline of what it will look like. I'll first start with an introduction and give you some sort of information on my professional background. This will hopefully segue well into my own work within One Health and sort of expanding the mental health framework, and also just sort of talk about how I got introduced to One Health as well. I'm fully aware that most everyone in this Zoom room is fully aware of what the One Health framework is, but I did put this invitation out into my personal and professional network. So I also want to very quickly talk about the One Health framework, what it is. But again, for folks that obviously are well acquainted with it, I think it's helpful just to give a general outline to sort of frame the discussion of how and why mental health is an integral or can be an integral component for the One Health framework. And with that in mind, I want to very briefly do the impossible, which is to try to talk about, well, what is mental health? And particularly, how could we frame it, conceptualize it? How can we measure it if we're considering putting it into, a One Health study or intervention? After that, I just want to, quickly go through some of the work I've done in One Health and mental health and with future directions. And I get kind of animated as I do these Zoom conversations, particularly as time goes on, because it feels, weird talking to a blank screen. But I hope that this conversation fosters some questions, and I'd love to, have a dialogue with y'all if time and energy permits. So just getting started with an introduction with myself. Every introduction begins with a hello. So hello to you all. Thank you again for having me. Next is my joke that I now present to you the letters behind my name so you know how that you could take me seriously. So I got my master's in public health and master's in social work at Tulane University in 2012. I think most of you all know what public health is. If you're not aware of the profession of social work, it's actually a very hard profession to describe, but it's a helping profession. Some of y'all may have, intersected with some social workers in your lives. It's built upon something called ecological systems theory. This is a key, if not the key concept in social work, which emphasizes that social workers don't see individuals as individuals. We see them as responsive to or products of their environment. And in particular, we look at things like economic inequalities, poverty, gender, race, etc. And one thing within the field of social work we're trying to actively do is to include other ecological factors like the natural environment and sort of seeing the person within the environment. I also have my LCSW, which means I'm a licensed clinical social worker. So briefly, what that means is after I graduated, I worked for quite a bit of time as a mental health professional, particularly, so not exactly therapy in the traditional sense, but working in these acute psychiatric spaces where I worked with populations with severe and chronic mental illness like schizophrenia, suicidality, psychosis, etc. That was, a very important and interesting time in my life. I'm watching this story or this show called The Pit on HBO. If you've ever seen it, that takes place in an emergency department. I did some emergency department social work for a little bit before I went back to school to get my PhD in social work from Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, which was just recently devastatingly hit by severe tornadoes. So what my area study was at WashU was climate change and its impact on mental health, but that's actually where I got introduced to the One Health framework, and I'll talk a bit about that. And I'm currently at the University of Georgia School of Social Work, as I guess you know. So one thing I just want to quickly talk about my identity, both professional and personal, before I go forward. I'll share with you a very pixelated photo of myself. This was a proto selfie done in a digital camera. This was almost 20 years ago. This is right after Hurricane Katrina. So we're, remembering this 20 years later this August. I was living in New Orleans, just graduated undergrad. I had no direction to speak of really. And when this storm hit, um, I lost my belongings, including what we call compact disc players. This itself should it be its own talk, and I have to kind of quickly fly over it for the sake of time. But the reason I'm bringing this forward is that it's 20 years later, and we still need to remember what happened. But also, this is an unfortunate, good example of sort of what's happening with our changing environment, and particularly impacts on marginalized populations. And so, with that in mind, I also want to disclose that while this certainly traumatized myself, speaking of mental health impacts, I was privileged enough to experience something called post-traumatic growth because of the privilege that I have, being able to go to a family in Florida and have the time and space to heal from this, devastating impact, as opposed to folks who intergenerationally live in New Orleans, particularly Black folks that did not have that luxury. So again, I just wanted to kind of quickly fly over that. But the last thing I'll say is for, us that are in the helping profession, like many of you all, we kind of do this for a reason, and usually it starts from a personal reason, and this is part of my story, and I think it actually, works well with the talk that we're having today. So as I mentioned, I get kind of wiry and anxious as I do these talks, and sometimes I throw some stupid jokes. So this is going to come up in a second. But I want to sort of quickly talk about my transition from being a clinical social worker to sort of entering the research space, particularly in my PhD program at Washington University. So what my focus was on, and this has its own story, but it was on and still is on how climate change impacts farmer mental health. And I did this through something called a participatory approach, meaning I did a lot of qualitative research. And this was grounded in the experiences of the farmers and the participants in the study. But also I did a systems-based approach, which goes back to this idea that we see people in environments within the field of social work. And what the Department of Defense labels climate change as, it labels it as a stress multiplier. And that climate change, while obviously it has direct impacts on mental health, it mostly puts stressors on existing inequalities and existing stressors. So here's my bad joke. This is a picture of me doing my research. This is a character from a show I like to watch. But I'm just sort of giving a visual representation of what it was like for me in my PhD program. But as I was sort of, getting into this direction and doing the reading and planning my dissertation proposal, I was able to attend a talk by this woman who maybe some of you know. Her name is Dr. Sharon Deem. She's a wildlife veterinarian who works out of the St. Louis Zoo and also is affiliated with Washington University. And this is where I was introduced to One Health and sort of like reframing how I see human beings and their relationship to the natural environment. And I'll talk a bit more about this experience later. I don't know how she feels about being next to this gentleman here on this slide. I'm going to talk kind of very quickly about One Health. I know most of you know what it is, but for the folks in the room that don't, this will be helpful. I put the label of the University of Tennessee's One Health Initiative to acknowledge that most of y'all already know what it is. But the first thing we should say is that it is a framework as well as a consortium of researchers and practitioners. But what is a framework? A framework helps us to conceptualize complicated relationships and concepts and phenomena. So, what the One Health framework sort of maps out is that human health, environmental health, or ecosystem health, and animal health are all, intricately connected to, represent one health. I considered throwing a big DUH, over this image because I hope that this is, intuitive for many people. But what I really love about it is that it addresses these sort of severances that human beings want to create between themselves and the natural world. Even saying the natural world, puts us human beings as a separate entity when we are a part of the natural world. And this actually relates to the topic of mental health because speaking of severances, we as humans tend to put a division between physical health and mental health when these are one and the same thing. And I'll talk more about that later. The other sort of obvious important pillar to One Health is the interdisciplinary component, which I could best represent by a really terrible stock image of office workers doing an awkward high five behind a sunset. But yeah, we cannot, thank you, Joy. We cannot, do this work. We cannot address the environmental challenges that we are facing without doing truly interdisciplinary work. And this is something that is on the masthead of every single academic department. Everyone says this, but this is incredibly hard to do. It's hard to do because we're all trained into doing very specific research or very specific practices. It's because of funding mechanisms, and we're separated by that, but we're also separated by things like language. Social workers speak a very different language than that of anthropologists, than that of physicians, than that of veterinarians. And these divisions can become real and become severe. And it could be a real challenge to sort of be in the room with different professions and have that sort of humbling experience that you may have something conceptually not wrong, but conceptually maybe malaligned. And actually, I'll be talking about a specific instance of that later. So those are the two pillars of One Health. We can now move forward to what is mental health, which is again an incredibly impossible thing to describe, but we have some definitions. The World Health Organization, this is an often cited definition, saying that mental health is a state of well-being that enables us to cope with the stresses of life, to realize our own abilities, to learn well and work well, and to contribute to our community. Now, what does that mean? It basically means that mental health, I'm going to do that, I'm sure. Mental health is a real concept that is cultural, bound, and contextual. Means that mental health is very specific to us and where we come from in our families, in our intergenerational lineage, in our country, in our culture, in our context. And this very culture-bound concept affects how we see ourselves in relationship to the world. It affects how we cope with not just the daily stressors of life, but the traumatic stressors that occur along the way. It affects our relationships. It affects the way we see everything. And it's also impacted by a lot of things, such as who you are in this world. If you are a Black American, it's impacted by the political context, it's impacted by poverty, etc. The other thing I just want to underline is that there is no health without mental health. That is within the World Health Organization sort of definition on mental health. And again, underlines the importance of why One Health, there I go again, why mental health needs to be an integral component of One Health. Before moving forward, I want us to sort of consider, well, what impacts mental health? And the best way to sort of consider that is just to think about your own mental health and what is impacting it now. That would be a lot. It would be, have you eaten lunch today? It would be if something traumatic happened to you recently. Again, it would be all these contextual factors that I mentioned before. And so if you haven't heard of this, a helpful way to sort of consider what impacts mental health is something called the social determinants of mental health. This looks at societal conditions that impact mental health, including economic stability, education, access to healthcare, and social support networks. But I also want to we need to include other environmental or ecological factors like climate or environmental health. So before going to the topic of how does mental health figure within the One Health framework, if you're interested yourself into how do I sort of incorporate mental health within a One Health study or intervention? You would want to consider, well, how do you measure mental health? And so, again, going back to how you are all feeling right now, how would you, figure out how to measure your own mental health? Well, in like the mental health practicing world rather, we often ask, well, how are you doing? In addition to things like, tell me about your parents or something like that. But more specific measures of mental health you may have heard of. One is, through something called diagnoses. Diagnoses are a specific cluster of symptoms that meet together and pass what we call a clinical threshold to give us something called like major depressive disorder or schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or generalized anxiety disorder. Diagnoses are actually a fairly complicated concept to measure. You have to be very specially trained to do so. So some other things that we can measure instead of these constellation of symptoms, we can measure specific symptoms themselves. And we can do this through things like scaling questions. You definitely have seen these like in a doctor's office where they generally do like a depression questionnaire. So you can measure things like symptoms of anxiety, symptoms of depression, or symptoms of trauma. But what I also want us to remember is that mental health encompasses a lot of things, and it's not just negative. There's also positive indicators of mental health that we should consider through things like subjective well-being, resiliency, or even happiness. And one more way that we can consider measuring mental health, especially when we're remembering that it's a very contextual experience. So, an example of this would be, and this is very broad and generalized, but in Southeast Asia, there are certain communities where symptoms of trauma are not felt through what we would like deem mental experiences like they are in a Western context. So certain populations, symptoms of trauma are actually very somatic experience. They're felt in the body through things like cardiovascular health, but even through things like sore teeth or sore eyes. And so there's other ways to measure what we call sort of subjective experiences of mental health or perspectives. And this could be done through things like qualitative methods, which explore people's lived experiences using such approaches as one-on-one interviews where you're recording actual words and finding themes through these words, focus groups, and also ethnographic approaches to understand emotional experiences within, the specific context and the specific meaning of the population you're working with. Okay, so I hope this is all making sense, and then this is interesting to you all. That's what I call an incredibly vague and brief summation of what mental health is. And I hope to sort of set the framework of why we need to integrate mental health within the One Health framework. I think to sort of start to give examples of how this could be done, it could be helpful just to sort of frame some of the work I've done in this area. And the way I'll frame this is sort of in a linear fashion. I'll talk about some work that I've done, which is concrete, some work that I'm currently working on, and then I'll get a bit more vague, but some work that I'm very interested in working on in the near or far future. And this is done for multiple purposes, obviously to introduce you all to the work I'm doing, but to sort of maybe facilitate some ideas for folks that could be related to some of the work that I'm considering. So let's go back to me in my PhD program and Dr. Sharon Deem. So I, heard her talk on One Health and it was incredibly interesting. And I remember asking her and having multiple conversations with her about, well, what is mental health considered within the One Health framework? And she said, absolutely. And this was, affirmed by, as I got more interested in the framework, affirmed by, a lot of editorials or sort of mastheads on One Health websites that sort of introduce One Health. Like basically most brief, conceptualizations of it do include that we find mental health to be important and integral in conceptualizations of health generally. So I was trying to find some research on this, studies that use the One Health framework to measure mental health outcomes. And what I noticed is I was having a lot of difficulty finding specific studies extending beyond. I feel like I got blurry. Let me see if that works. Okay, extending beyond, just sort of general declarations or commentaries that mental health is important. So with the help of some friends of mine and colleagues, I implemented something called a systematic scoping review, where we looked at all of the available evidence to see how many studies use the One Health framework to measure mental health outcomes. So if you're not aware of what like a systematic review is, this is where you use systematic search strategies to scour a lot of literature. This takes forever to sort of like get a very clear and systematic outline of what's been done. And so in sort of the One Health fashion, I wanted to do this in a truly interdisciplinary way. So in addition to, a friend and colleague of mine that's a mental health professional, I also worked with two veterinarians to sort of help conceive and implement this project, one of which is on the call today. And one really interesting thing that is maybe deserves again its own conversation, but which came up in sort of the important pre-conceptualization process of doing this review is one of these veterinarians was like, have you heard of eco health? Have you heard of planetary health? And I was like, no, I haven't. And I know there's a lot of conversations on this, but I was reading sort of backgrounds on these frameworks and I saw a lot of similarities, which was really interesting considering that, all of these frameworks stress interdisciplinary approaches, but there were some differences, one being sort of the general type of professionals that sort of work within these frameworks. So like public health professionals generally work more in the planetary health framework, for instance. But with that being said, I'm just explaining that's why we included both planetary and eco health within this review. And so next, I just sort of want to give a general outline of what we found to sort of start us off on, well, where does One Health sort of stand with looking at mental health generally? And the big finding was, well, there's not a lot of studies. We only found 13 studies. And within that group, 7 of those use the One Health framework and 3 use eco and planetary health. So it wasn't a lot. So obviously part of my presentation is a general plea that we need to, be including mental health outcomes within these studies. But I'll give you sort of a general summary of what we found that has been done specifically within One Health and looking at mental health outcomes. So there was a predominant focus on looking at the health of domestic animals, particularly companion animals, when exploring, human mental health outcomes. And this makes sense given that, One Health has a strong history within the veterinary profession. And there was also a general focus on animal welfare. One study mentioned a concept called biophilia. I saw this concept also mentioned a lot in sort of the general commentaries on One Health and mental health. If you're not aware of what biophilia is, it argues that humans have an innate biological need to connect with non-human organisms, and this influences health and well-being. And what this one study, which included it, and I have the citation below if you want to look at it later, it says that companion animals, again, there's a large focus on companion animals, but they can sort of act as a healing connection to the natural world. So if you're interested in, conducting a study that incorporates mental health into, your One Health study, please read this paper. There's a lot of recommendations, and, cite me too. That'll be good for my tenure metrics. But, I'll offer a couple here that are pertinent to our discussion. The one is, just going back to my social work roots, we always want to consider vulnerable and at-risk populations, but this is also because these are populations that are more at risk for impacts from our changing environment, and these are populations that for the most part contribute the least to our changing environments. Also, we put in a large section where we sort of put in mental health terms that you can consider, particularly mental health terms that measure mental health within a changing context. There's specific mental health terms that do that, including but not limited to eco anxiety and solastalgia. So I could briefly describe what these concepts are. Solastalgia is almost like eco grief. It refers to our sort of natural emotional responses to sort of these uncontrollable changes to the surrounding landscape that you're particularly close with. That's where solace comes from. You get solace from the land, but the land is changing because of things like climate change or environmental degradation. The term actually came from a study on sort of environmental degradation and impacts from a mining operation with the local population. So this is like eco grief. and impacts particularly indigenous populations, populations that are already have these intergenerational ties to the land, but also farmers as well. And also there's a term called eco anxiety, which, differentiating it from eco grief, grieving what has happened. Anxiety is, worried about what's going to happen. So there's this sort of budding literature on measuring the anxiety felt about what's going to happen to our planet due to these environmental and climatic changes. So going back to the recommendations, what I put initially into our paper, which I submitted for publication, was we need to particularly look at mental health outcomes in both plants and animals. Going back to sort of this idea that physical health and mental health are interconnected. So, like with humans, depression and anxiety can impact physical health, and physical ailments can, negatively influence mental health. With animals, stress hormones are, necessary for survival, but they can impact immune functions, which could, impact human health. And in plants, plant stress or external factors that trigger sudden changes can impact growth of plants, flowering or seed germination. So I put in this sort of recommendation that we should be looking at, plant and animal mental health. I got one reviewer that was like, "Oh, that's super interesting. Could you talk more about that?" And this is where the conversations between interdisciplinary professionals is really important. So she's here on the line, but my friend and colleague Jess told me, "Wait, hold on a second. How did I miss this? Animal mental health, it's not a real thing." And I was like, "What? No, it is. I know it's real. I have a cat. My cat has emotions. I've been reading Mama's Last Hug, which is a fantastic book, and we had just a really wonderful conversation where I may be misrepresenting what we said, but essentially said, obviously it's real, but just the concept, the phrasing of animal mental health, this doesn't have an explicit definition. And what we noticed, sort of both anecdotally, but also sort of looking at some general searches in the literature, especially within the social sciences, this term animal mental health was getting thrown out a bit. And this is concerning that, this can cause confusion where you sort of give a term that doesn't have an explicit definition. And we wanted to look at this more. So we are currently doing a systematic scoping review, again, doing this wide search of the literature where we're seeing how people conceptualize and characterize the phrase animal mental health, or the mental health of animals, or the mental well-being of animals. And the reason why we're doing this is that there is a collective increasing understanding that animals do have complex emotional lives. And also, the field of animal welfare is becoming more holistic, and understanding that animal welfare encompasses more than just freedom from physical pain or disease. So, with this understanding, we sort of want to sort of set a standard that we need to still be grounded in scientific understandings when we're exploring things like that, particularly, within my field of social sciences. So, this is really exciting. We recorded almost 8,000 papers. So we reviewed 8,000 abstracts. This is the longest full screen assessment I've ever done in my life. It's 5,400 full screen assessments. We have 430 to go. And as of now, what we're going to be doing is extracting, probably growing a little bit, 221 papers, where we'll be sort of like setting the standard. Well, how do people sort of conceptualize the term animal mental health? And I hope that this will be a good contribution to the field. So if you haven't noticed, I'm kind of going forward in some work that I've done, and then after that, I'll do future directions. So a project that I just started, I'm not very much sold on the name Nature Pill, but what this is an intervention that has been developed that sort of measures the mental health impacts from nature-based experiences. And I just got linked up to this project. We're actually turning in our IRB proposal tomorrow, so that's what I'll be working on immediately after this. But what we're doing is we're sort of looking at the mental health impact of nature experiences, particularly in military populations and also families of militaries. So this is a real exciting project. We're just starting, that if you have any questions, I could answer more of. But we could look really briefly at how we're going to be measuring these impacts. So I mentioned, some ways we can measure like through scales. Another way that we can measure mental health impacts are through biomarkers as well. So we're still looking at the feasibility of this, but we're set to go. We're going to be looking actually at saliva stress hormones to see if there's any sort of before and after changes, before and after these sort of nature-based experiences. We'll also be looking at self-reported measures of mental well-being. Some of these I mentioned before. And one thing that I'm particularly going to be doing is looking at subjective experiences. And this would be sort of more rich, descriptions of how this was through something called focus groups. And what I'm really excited about this is that, this is work done through the Department of Ecology and Public Health and Landscape Architecture as well at the University of Georgia. And we've already sort of talking about, we're maybe getting ahead of ourselves, but if this works out well, expanding this to sort of look more specifically of how measures of ecosystem diversity can impact mental health, which is something I'm incredibly interested in. And I kind of want to briefly talk about this other concept that is really interesting to me. And if you haven't noticed, I'm now sort of saying interesting a lot because I'm sort of throwing a lot of things at the wall to see if they may stick with y'all. But I don't know if any of you all have heard of this concept called shifting baseline syndrome. This was developed through someone doing a study in fisheries, actually. And if you're interested, I have the link to this paper in the PowerPoint. The title is there below. But basically, what this is that we all have sort of our own conceptualization of what we're sort of like impacts from our changing environment. So for instance, for me, when I was a kid, right, there was a lot of what I've noticed a major change from being a kid to now is like the windshield effect with bugs, right? So that's my baseline. Often our baselines or our reference points are sort of our earlier memories. And what we don't realize is that there's differing baselines from previous generations. So there's sort of documentation of like so many birds in the air that they blocked out the sun, right? That it almost like, formed almost an eclipse situation. Or when Christopher Columbus landed in Hispaniola or Cuba, his sailors couldn't get to sleep at night because there were so many sea turtles banging against the bows of the ship. So I'm just sort of bringing this forward because this is a concept that I'm interested in, particularly ecosystem diversity, how sort of reductions in diversity not only obviously impact ecosystems, but also impact human well-being. And going back to just my profession as a social worker, social workers, I don't think I mentioned this, we have an ethical value system that says we are always working with vulnerable and at-risk populations. And obviously there's some interesting changes in the political climate to things like talking about diversity, but we fully believe that diversity is strength, diversity of viewpoints, diversity of experiences. And for myself, I think this also needs to include diversity of ecosystems. So I just have a couple other, I think actually this is the last sort of project I'm working on, and this goes actually more into the more distant future, but this is something I just want to briefly describe, and I think One Health could have a pretty interesting impact in researching farmer mental health. Farmers, if you aren't aware, are obviously incredibly important to our lives. They're often overlooked for multiple reasons, one being literally physically, they're in rural populations, but also culturally as well. And I did this research study where I was looking at the impact of climate change on farmer mental health. This wasn't a One Health study per se, but one thing that I did was I did sort of a very brief ethnography where I was working on a hog farm up in Iowa. And this is a photo of some piglets that I helped to unload, and a photo of some 250 to 350 pound hogs that we had to like round up into a semi truck to be sent to a meat processing plant, which was a psychologically interesting experience. And one thing that I just noticed that I didn't quite capture in my dissertation was that, I mean, farming is an incredibly stressful job. It has early hours. Climate change is making the job more stressful. But there is also the reality of there's an increasing industrialization of farming, particularly in concentrated feeding operations. This is done for a lot of reasons. One is that it helps us to eat more diverse diets, and it helps nutritional requirements, but also there's definitely a capitalist component to this. A lot of farms are very sort of being swept up. I don't know if unwillingly is the right word, but it's not really to their best interest into this industrialization of farming. I equate it actually a lot to what a lot of physicians go through. They're sort of working through a system governed by um, insurance rather than governed by like health principles. And so I just started to notice that there was something more to be said here regarding farmer mental health, sort of being interconnected with the strains of the animals, the animal welfare of the livestock, but also even the environmental strains that impact or that are impacted by industrial farming. So I think given that One Health looks at human, animal, and environmental well-being, and looking at industrial agriculture, we could see trends in increasing of human strain or human stress, including economic stress. You're always sort of trying to get above the red in this type of farming. Social isolation, farmers are finding themselves more socially isolated, but also this sort of moral conflict where I will not use the word animal abuse because there's a lot of real laws and real regulation, and a lot of farmers took very much offense to sort of that framing. But there were some interesting sort of, emotional impacts I was noticing with these hogs. And so there's this animal strain resulting from confined conditions and impacts from growth hormones, and also environmental strain, including, impacts to surrounding soil and water systems, but also overall sort of the overall climactic impacts of increasing industrial agriculture. So if you could tell, this isn't a very well cooked idea, but this is just something I just sort of like to put forward some things I'm considering. I noticed that farmers did express feeling very trapped within this system. And sort of speaking of interlocking systems, I think that One Health could be sort of helpful in framing farmer mental health as a systematic issue and not just an individual one. And having a One Health intervention could help, result not just in healthier farms and healthier farmers, but also, healthier ecosystems and healthier animals. Sort of these like win-win interventions that One Health speaks a lot of. Okay. I think I'm doing okay on time, so I'll take an extended sip of water as I go into future directions. These are some things that I hope that we could consider, as takeaways from this presentation, both generally and specifically. I obviously want us to consider including mental health within One Health research. That is sort of a big plea of this presentation. Including mental health outcomes give us a much clearer and holistic picture of overall health. As a social worker, I obviously want us to continue to consider marginalized populations and to use culturally grounded approaches, both to accurately capture mental health experiences without using, just a Western or white lens. This is really important because we won't be capturing the full impacts if we're not doing this. But also, again, just recognizing that I believe One Health is vital for sort of both measuring impacts of our changing environment, but also in creating interventions. And we always need to consider marginalized humans and non-humans that are being disproportionately impacted by these changes compared to, say, me, who lives, a relatively comfortable lifestyle, in air conditioning and these sort of filtered systems where I'm not as impacted by these changing environmental impacts. And also, going back to the pillars of One Health, we need to foster collaboration and, really develop a shared language and to include mental health professionals to bridge these disciplinary silos. I didn't really talk about this, but mental health professional, this is a very vague term, and that's okay. This can include social workers, psychiatrists, but also sort of non-traditional mental health support systems like the clergy or any other sort of professional body that is also involved in the mental health of populations. That was very vague, but some more sort of specific things that we could consider. And I actually think this is my last slide. If you're starting to check out, we're almost done. Um, so I think we really need to focus on, innovative methods. I think that's the really great thing about One Health is that it really allows for such a thing. This is a fairly long and extensive list of some methods we can consider, but we could use creative and arts-based approaches. I came across this field called multi-species ethnography I found really fascinating. Actually, the sort of work I've been doing, the extended work I'm doing with farmer mental health, where I started to more deeply consider the connections between, the health of hogs and the sort of actually relational aspects of, hogs and farmers are both sort of trapped in this stressful system. I did it actually through painting, and I actually am working a paper on that. I know that's sort of random, but we can include a lot of different types of creative methods like photo voice or other ways to sort of capture hard to measure or sort of complex concepts. Participatory work, I think, is always vital in this, working in tandem rather with the population of interest. Longitudinal studies are obviously important, as well as systems-based methodologies. And all of these combined can capture complex and nonlinear experiences. In addition, there's a lot of other methods I didn't bring forward, but I may have touched upon in terms of measuring mental health, but also in these types of studies, including biosensors, geospatial data. I have a friend, and I believe someone here, that just did a photo voice project using geospatial data, and also things like ethnography to map the complex and lived dimensions of mental health as it intersects with environmental and animal systems. I think there's a lot of potential we could do here, and it's something I'm personally really excited about. And that's my that's my cat Pork Chop. Yeah, hi girl. And this is my slide where I ask if there's any questions, and I include my email. Yeah, I hope if there are any, please send them my way. And if not, you could obviously contact me through my email. Thank you so much.
That was awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Um, y'all should be able to unmute yourselves if you have any questions for Chris, or you can put something in the chat as well. We've still got a few minutes left in the hour. Give everyone a little time to
Of course.
relate some Q&A.
I find on Zoom talks, sometimes there's a long wait and then 3 people ask questions at the same time. Oh, I see there's some in the chat. Can you field that for me if that's okay? Or I could try to click on it too.
Oh yeah, no. Fiona says, great job, such interesting, important work. Joey says she's digesting.
Sure. And
Thank
Joey, your screen has been on, which I appreciate. Thank you for your reactions throughout.
You're welcome. Yeah, when I have to be on Zoom and nobody's on camera, I'm like, this is weird.
I understand turning your camera off, but also as the speaker, you start to lose your mind a little bit. So it was comforting to see your reactions. Thank you.
Okay, we do have a question in the
Sure.
chat. Have you seen any research using shifting baseline syndrome in the context of community spaces and our lived social support environment?
God, what a good question. And you caught me. No, this is a reminder that when I put forward a concept that I'm interested in, I should perhaps do some more research on it. There's always limited time, it feels like. But no, actually I haven't. I'm sure it's been done. I know that it was done in the context of fisheries, but I thought it was a helpful sort of framework to put forward first within climate change, but also with One Health. But no, I'm curious if the person asking has any more thoughts on this, but another reason I wanted to bring this forward is that I think that sort of considering that our own reference points and framework for what could be are also sometimes limited just by our own limited experiences and our own lived lives. I find it super fascinating just to read just like firsthand accounts of what the natural world used to be. And it's just the bugs is one thing. The you just look up in the sky and there used to be so many birds. I think this loss does have impacts, but to answer your question, no. And I'm actually going to copy and paste this question and look this up myself. Thank you for that.
All right, we have another question. Can you say more about whether mental health is talked about differently in the planetary versus eco versus One Health literatures?
I just unshared, I think. Can you repeat the question, please?
Oh, yeah. Can you say more about whether mental health is talked about differently in planetary versus eco versus One Health literature?
It's not necessarily talked about differently, but what I noticed is that, and again, this is one of these sort of topics that could take a really interesting turn, is that there was sort of differences in the type of research being done. So with EcoHealth, there was a more predominant focus on qualitative methods, and they put a more predominant focus on participatory work. And this is work that is done predominantly by ecologists, but they have a very strong sort of weight on using these participatory approaches. So for instance, there was a study on sort of the emotional connections between Inuit populations and sled dogs. And within planetary health, this is developed, I believe, out of the Harvard School of Public Health. So it has a more public health focus. And I saw sort of less patterns there. So I can't really say that there was patterns in like the way mental health was conceived, but there certainly was patterns in sort of the way these sort of planetary or ecological connections to mental health were being conceived. It's a really interesting topic that I've had more conversations outside of here with practitioners, but yeah, it's super interesting.
All right, that's all we have in the chat right now. Give everyone just another minute or two. All right, I don't see anything else
Sure.
popping up. I'll maybe sign us off really slowly in case anyone is typing.
Yeah.
But thank you again so much. That was a really wonderful talk. For anyone who wants to give it another listen or share it with a friend, it'll be on our website, probably by tomorrow afternoon on our seminar webpage. All of our previous talks are on there. Chris has put his email in the chat if anyone wants to contact him after this. And the other thing, I'll just remind everyone to tune in next month on June 26th, I believe it is. Yes. Yeah, and with that, we'll just give y'all back like 12 minutes of your lunch break.
Yeah.
And hope everyone has a good rest of their day.
Great. And thank you again for inviting me, Alyssa. Thank you.
We really enjoyed it. Thanks for being here. And tell Pork Chop we said hi.
Yes, I will give her a scratch on the cheek for you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.